In child psychology, let's see about classical conditioning. It's also known as Pavlovian conditioning or respondent conditioning. It is a learning through association. So it is first described by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov in 19th century. In the 1890s, Pavlov was experimenting with dogs, ringing a bell whenever they were fed. So over time, the dogs learned to associate a neutral stimulus. The neutral stimulus is bell ringing with a positive one. Here the positive is food. So the Pavlov also noticed that his dog would often begin to salivate whenever they hear the footsteps of his assistant bringing them the food. So this association between positive and neutral stimuli become the foundation of classical conditioning theory. So here the positive is food. So the classical conditioning theory states that behaviors are learned by connecting a neutral stimulus with a positive one, such as the neutral stimulus is Pavlov's dogs hearing a bell, and the positive one is expecting the food. So the learned behavior is called a conditioned response. So the normal process like salivating when you smell food is what is called unconditioned response. So hearing the bell and expecting the food is a conditioned process. If you salivating when you smell the food, it is a unconditioned response. So here the unconditioned response, there is salivation when you smell or see the food is unconditioned stimulus. Here the food is unconditioned stimulus. And when you hear the bell ringing, that is a neutral stimulus alone with no food, is the dog is producing no response. When you hearing the bell along with food, the dog is keeping salivation. So it is an unconditioned response. And over a period of time, when the dog is hear the bell, it is a conditioned stimulus. So the dog is producing salivation, it is a conditioned stimulus. So the stage 1 is before conditioning, something in the environment triggers a natural response in the subject. So during this stage, no new behavior has been learned yet. So this stage also includes a neutral stimulus which doesn't affect the subject. So there is a neutral stimulus, that is a ringing bell doesn't affect the subject. Here the subject is dog. So before conditioning, there is no response. It is a stage 1. And stage 2 is during conditioning. This is the stage where the neutral stimulus becomes associated with the positive stimulus that caused the response during the first stage. In Pavlov's experiment, this stage involved ringing a bell when the dogs were fed. So ringing the bell along with we give the food to the dog. So after the repeated exposure, the dog began to associate the bell with food and would salivate when they heard it, even if no food was present. So during conditioning, so the dog began to associate the bell with food. It would salivate when the food is not here, but when it hear the ring. And stage 3, after conditioning. During the final stage of conditioning, the neutral stimulus is firmly associated with the unconditioned response. So this creates a new behavior or what is known as the conditioned response. So after conditioning, when the dog is hearing the bell, he starts to salivate. But there is no food is along with bell. So it is a conditioning response. So what is conditioned response? In classical conditioning, the conditioned response, that is CR, is the learned response to the previously neutral stimulus. Here the neutral stimulus is bell ringing. In Ivan Pavlov's experiment in classical conditioning, the dog's salivation was the conditioned response to the sound of a bell. It is a conditioned response. Dog starts to salivate when it hear the sound of a bell. It is a conditioned response. What is acquisition? In the initial learning period, acquisition describes when an organism learns to connect a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. So it is an initial learning period. It starts to describe and it starts to connect a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. It is called acquisition. So the next phase is extinction. So in psychology, extinction refers to gradual weakening of a conditioned response by breaking the association between the conditioned and the unconditioned stimuli. What is extinction? There is a break in the association between the conditioned and the unconditioned stimulus. So here the example is when the bell repeatedly rang, but no food was presented. So Pavlov's dog gradually stopped salivating at the sound of the bell because only there is a bell rang, but there is no food was given to the dog. So over a period of time, the dog stops salivating at the sound of the bell. It is called extinction. It is the another condition. So the second condition is extinction. The third condition is spontaneous recovery. So it is a phenomenon of Pavlovian conditioning that refers to the return of a conditioned response in a weaker form after a period of time following extinction. So for example, when Pavlov waited for a few days after extinguishing the conditioned response and then rang the bell once more and the dog salivated again. So here the spontaneous recovery, the dog after extinguishing the conditioned response. So it forgetted the conditioned response and few days after then rang the bell once more, the dog started to salivate. It is a spontaneous recovery condition. It is a third condition, spontaneous recovery condition. So first one is acquisition, second is extinction, and third one is spontaneous recovery, and the fourth condition is generalization. So in psychology, generalization is the tendency to respond in the same way to stimuli that are similar but not identical to the conditioned stimulus. It's similar but not identical to the conditioned stimulus. For example, in Pavlov's experiment, if a dog is conditioned to salivate to the sound of a bell, it may later salivate to a higher pitched bell. So in generalization, in Pavlov's experiment, if a dog is conditioned to salivate to the sound of the bell, it may later salivate to a higher pitched bell. So it is a difference. So it salivate to higher pitched bell. So it is the generalization condition. So the fourth condition is generalization in Pavlov's conditioning theory. The fifth one is discrimination. Here in classical conditioning, discrimination is a process through which individuals learn to differentiate among similar stimuli and respond appropriately to each one. So in generalization, in similar but no difference, but here in discrimination, similar stimuli and respond appropriately to each one of the stimuli, they respond. So for example, eventually Pavlov's dog learns the difference between the sound of the two bells and no longer salivates at the sound of the non-food bell. If we produce two kind of bell, one bell is given with along with the food and one is non-food bell. So it starts to difference between the two bells and no